I never thought I'd be telling this story in a courtroom. But sometimes life forces you into battles you never wanted to fight, against people you never expected to become your enemies. My name is Tyler, and this is the story of how my own parents tried to destroy my life, and how a judge's words changed everything. It started 3 years ago when I was 19. I know that sounds young, and maybe it was, but I had just gotten my girlfriend Lucy pregnant. We'd been together since junior year of high school, and despite what everyone thought, we were serious about each other. Lucy was 18, just graduated and working part-time at a local bookstore while taking community college classes. I was working construction with my dad's company, making decent money for someone my age. We weren't rich, but we were managing. When we found out about the baby, I did what I thought was right. I proposed. My parents, Helen and Frank, did not take it well. "Tyler, you're throwing your life away," my mother said the night I told them about our engagement. "You're 19 years old, you haven't even figured out who you are yet." "I know who I am," I replied. "I'm going to be a father and a husband." My father was more direct. "This is a mistake, son, a big one. You think you know what love is. You think you're ready for marriage and kids. You've got no idea what you're getting into." But I was stubborn. Maybe it was the pregnancy hormones affecting Lucy, or maybe it was my own pride, but we went ahead with a small wedding at the courthouse. Just us, Lucy's parents as witnesses, and a justice of the peace. My parents refused to come. That should have been my first warning sign. The next few months were tough. My parents barely spoke to me. When they did, it was always criticism about my choices, my maturity, my ability to provide for a family. They constantly questioned whether Lucy and I were really ready for this responsibility. But when our son Oliver was born, everything changed for me. Holding that tiny, perfect baby in my arms, I knew without a doubt that I had made the right choice. Lucy was an amazing mother from day one, and despite being young, we were doing okay. My parents came to visit Oliver a few times, but their attitude was strange. They weren't warm or supportive grandparents. Instead, they seemed to be studying us. Watching how we interacted with the baby, taking notes about our living situation, our work schedules, our finances. "We're just concerned," my mother would say whenever I questioned their behavior. "We want what's best for Oliver." 3 months after Oliver was born, Lucy and I had our first real fight as new parents. It was nothing major. We were both exhausted, stressed about money, and adjusting to parenthood. We raised our voices, said some things we didn't mean, and then worked it out like adults do. But apparently my parents had been listening outside our apartment door. 2 days later, a social worker showed up at our home. "We've received a report about possible neglect and domestic violence," she explained, showing her badge. "I need to do a welfare check on the child." My heart dropped into my stomach. Lucy started crying. The social worker was professional but thorough, checking our apartment, our supplies for Oliver, asking questions about our relationship, our work, our support system. Thank God our apartment was clean, Oliver was healthy and well-fed, and we could provide documentation of his medical care. The social worker concluded there was no evidence of neglect or abuse and closed the case. But the damage was done. Someone had called in a false report on us. I confronted my parents that evening. "Did you call social services on us?" I demanded when I showed up at their house. "We're concerned about Oliver," my mother said calmly. "You two are so young and we heard you fighting." "Every couple fights sometimes," I said. "That doesn't mean we're abusing our child." "Tyler, you're not ready for this responsibility," my father said. "Maybe it would be better if Oliver came to stay with us for a while, just until you two get on your feet properly." That's when I realized what this was really about. They didn't just disapprove of my marriage, they wanted to take my son. "That's never going to happen," I told them. But they weren't done. Over the next few weeks, my parents became increasingly invasive. They would show up unannounced, demanding to see Oliver. They would criticize everything Lucy and I did, our parenting choices, our budget, our living situation, our work schedules. When I finally told them they needed to call before visiting and respect our boundaries as parents, my mother's mask slipped completely. "You think you can keep us away from our grandson?" she said coldly. "You're making a big mistake, Tyler." That threat sent chills down my spine. 2 weeks later, Lucy and I received legal papers. My parents were suing us for grandparents' rights and claiming we were unfit parents. They were asking for full custody of Oliver. I couldn't believe it. My own parents were trying to take my child away from me. Papers listed a series of accusations. That Lucy and I were too young and immature to properly care for a child. That we had financial instability. That we had anger management issues based on the domestic violence incident they had witnessed. And that Oliver would be better served living with his more mature and financially stable grandparents. Reading those papers felt like being punched in the gut. These weren't concerned grandparents, these were people trying to steal my son. Lucy was devastated. "Tyler, what if they win?" she kept asking. What if they actually take Oliver away from us? I hired a lawyer. Well, I tried to. The first 3 lawyers I called said they couldn't take the case because of conflicts of interest. Finally, the 4th lawyer, Patricia Coleman, agreed to represent us. This is unusual, she told me during our first meeting. Grandparents' rights cases are typically filed when there's evidence of actual abuse or when the parents are deceased or incarcerated. Your parents' case seems weak legally, but I have to warn you they've hired Mitchell and Associates. I'd never heard of Mitchell and Associates, but apparently they were one of the most expensive family law firms in the city. How can my parents afford lawyers like that? I asked. My dad made good money in construction, and my mom worked part-time as a receptionist, but they weren't wealthy. That's a good question, Patricia said. As we prepared for court, more details about my parents' case emerged. They had documented everything every time Lucy and I had argued, every bill we'd paid late, every moment of normal parenting stress they had witnessed. They had photographs of our modest apartment, bank statements showing our limited savings, work schedules proving we both worked full-time and relied on daycare for Oliver. But most shocking was a psychiatric evaluation they had somehow obtained, claiming that Lucy suffered from postpartum depression and that I showed signs of aggressive tendencies and poor impulse control. How did they get a psychiatric evaluation done without us knowing? I asked Patricia. They didn't, she said grimly. This was done by Dr. Alan Morse. He's known for writing evaluations based on second-hand information and observations. It's not technically illegal, but it's highly unethical. The picture became clearer. My parents weren't just concerned grandparents. They had been planning this custody grab for months, gathering evidence, hiring expensive lawyers, and building a case to take my son away. But why? Why would they go to such extreme lengths? The answer came from an unexpected source. 3 days before our court date, Patricia received a call from someone claiming to have information about my parents' case. The caller wanted to meet anonymously. It turned out to be Brenda, my mother's sister. Brenda and my mother hadn't spoken in years due to some family disagreement I'd never fully understood. Tyler, there's something you need to know about your parents, Brenda told us. This custody case isn't about what's best for Oliver. It's about money. She explained that my grandfather, my father's father, had died 2 years earlier and left behind a substantial inheritance. But there was a catch in the will. The money would be distributed among his descendants, but with a special provision. Any descendant who had legal custody of his great-grandchildren would receive double their inheritance share. My grandfather had apparently been very traditional and believed that children should be raised by the most established members of the family. Oliver was his first great-grandchild. According to Brenda, my parents' share of the inheritance was already significant, around $200,000. But if they gained custody of Oliver, that amount would double to $400,000. Your mother has been talking about this money for months, Brenda said. She keeps saying that taking care of Oliver would be an investment in the family's future. Suddenly, everything made sense. The constant criticism, the social services call, the expensive lawyers, the psychiatric evaluation, it wasn't about Oliver's well-being at all. It was about money. My parents were willing to destroy my family and steal my child for $400,000. Patricia immediately subpoenaed records related to my grandfather's will and my parents' finances. What we discovered was even worse than we thought. Not only were my parents motivated by the inheritance money, but they had already spent some of it. They had taken out a loan against their expected inheritance to pay for the expensive legal team. They were so confident they would win custody of Oliver that they had already committed the inheritance money they would receive. They couldn't afford to lose this case. The day of the custody hearing arrived. Walking into that courtroom was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. On one side sat Lucy and I with our lawyer. On the other side sat my parents with 3 attorneys from Mitchell and Associates. The judge was the Honorable Margaret Torres, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes. She had a reputation for being tough but fair. My parents' lawyers went first. They painted a picture of Lucy and me as irresponsible young parents who were in over our heads. They presented their evidence, photos of our small apartment, documentation of our limited income, the questionable psychiatric evaluation, and testimony about the social services call. Your Honor, said their lead attorney, while we don't question that Mr. Tyler and his wife love their child, love is not enough to provide proper care. These young people are struggling financially, emotionally, and mentally. The child would be much better served in the stable, mature home of his grandparents. They brought in character witnesses, neighbors who testified about hearing us argue, Lucy's former supervisor who said she sometimes seemed tired and distracted at work. Even our landlord who mentioned that we had been late on rent twice. It was brutal. They were taking every normal aspect of being young parents and twisting it into evidence of our unfitness. When it was our turn, Patricia painted a very different picture. She showed evidence of Oliver's excellent health records, his development milestones, and testimonials from our pediatrician about our attentive parenting. But the real bombshell came when she called Brenda to testify about the inheritance. "Can you explain to the court the financial motivation behind the plaintiff's custody request?" Patricia asked. My parents' lawyers immediately objected, but Judge Torres allowed the testimony. Brenda explained the inheritance structure, the doubling provision for custodial descendants, and my parents' financial commitment to the legal fees. The courtroom went dead silent. You could literally hear people breathing. Judge Torres looked directly at my parents. "Is this testimony accurate? Are you seeking custody of your grandson in order to claim additional inheritance money?" My father started to speak, but my mother cut him off. "Your Honor, the money is secondary. We genuinely believe Oliver would be better off with us." But the damage was done. Patricia then presented evidence of the loan my parents had taken against their expected inheritance, their communications with the law firm about payment plans, and documentation showing they had already made financial plans assuming they would gain custody of Oliver. The psychiatric evaluation fell apart when Patricia called Dr. Morse as a witness. Under questioning, he admitted he had never actually met or evaluated Lucy or me personally. His entire report was based on second-hand observations provided by my parents. "So you wrote a professional psychiatric evaluation about people you had never met, based solely on information provided by individuals who had a significant financial interest in the outcome of this case?" Patricia asked. "The information seemed reliable," Dr. Morse stammered. Judge Torres was not pleased. "Doctor, this evaluation is worthless as evidence in this court. I'm appalled that any licensed professional would produce such a document." The final blow came when Patricia revealed phone records showing that my parents had called social services themselves and made the false report about domestic violence and neglect. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs have systematically attempted to undermine these young parents through false reports, questionable psychiatric evaluations, and invasive surveillance, all in service of claiming an additional inheritance of $200,000. When it was time for closing arguments, my parents' expensive lawyers had very little to say. Their entire case had crumbled. Patricia's closing was powerful but simple. "Your Honor, this is not a case about whether these young parents are perfect. No parent is perfect. This is a case about whether loving, attentive parents should have their child taken away by individuals motivated primarily by financial gain." Then came the moment I'll never forget. Judge Torres looked directly at my parents, and her expression was a mixture of disgust and disappointment. "In 30 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated attempt to manipulate the family court system," she began. "What I have witnessed today is not grandparents concerned about their grandchild's welfare. What I have witnessed is a deliberate campaign to undermine young parents for financial gain." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing. "The evidence shows that the plaintiffs have made false reports to Child Protective Services, commissioned fraudulent psychiatric evaluations, and filed this custody petition not out of concern for the child, but to claim additional inheritance money. This behavior is not only reprehensible, but it demonstrates exactly the kind of character that should not have custody of any child." Judge Torres turned to look at Lucy and me. "Are these parents perfect? No. Are they young? Yes. But they are loving, attentive parents who have provided excellent care for their child. The evidence shows a healthy, well-cared-for baby and parents who, despite their youth and limited resources, have made their child's well-being their priority." She paused, looking back at my parents. "The plaintiff's petition for custody is denied. Furthermore, I am granting a restraining order preventing the plaintiffs from contacting the defendants or their child for a period of 1 year, with the exception of supervised visits. Court-approved facility should they choose to pursue that option." But Judge Torres wasn't done. "I want to be clear about something," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "This court exists to protect children and families, not to serve as a vehicle for adults to enrich themselves at the expense of loving parents. The behavior exhibited by the plaintiffs in this case, the false reports, the fraudulent documentation, the financial manipulation, is an abuse of the family court system that I will not tolerate." She looked directly at my parents' lawyers. "I am referring this matter to the State Bar Association for investigation into potential ethical violations in the commissioning and presentation of the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation." I'm also referring this case to the district attorney's office for potential prosecution for filing false reports with Child Protective Services. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo forever. My parents sat in shocked silence. My mother started crying not tears of sadness, but tears of rage and panic. My father's face had gone completely white. Lucy collapsed into my arms, sobbing with relief. We had won. Not only had we kept Oliver, but my parents faced potential criminal charges for what they had done. As we left the courtroom, I overheard one of my parents' expensive lawyers talking to them. "You never told us about the inheritance motivation. If we had known, we never would have taken this case. Our firm cannot be associated with this kind of fraud." My parents' financial gamble had backfired completely. Not only did they not get the extra inheritance money, but they were now facing legal bills they couldn't afford and potential criminal charges. The aftermath was swift and severe. Within a week, my parents' loan against the inheritance was called in by the bank. They had to sell their house to pay the legal fees and loan balance. Dr. Morse lost his license to practice after the state board investigation revealed he had written multiple fraudulent evaluations for financial gain. My parents were charged with filing false reports and ultimately pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges. They received probation and community service, but the damage to their reputation was permanent. As for Lucy and me, winning the custody case changed everything. We had proof that we were capable parents, recognition from the court system, and most importantly, our son was safe. The inheritance money that started this whole mess. It turned out my grandfathers will had one more provision my parents hadn't considered. Any descendant who was found by a court to have acted against the best interests of their family would forfeit their entire inheritance share. When the inheritance was finally distributed, my parents received nothing. Their portion was redistributed among other family members, including a small amount that came to me as my father's son. I used that money to put a down payment on a small house for our family. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had tried to steal my son for money, and in the process they lost everything: their money, their home, their relationship with their son and grandson, and their reputation. Today, 3 years later, Lucy and I are still happily married. Oliver is a healthy, happy 3-year-old who brings joy to our lives every single day. We've had another child since then, a daughter named Grace. We're not rich and we're still young, but we've built a loving, stable home for our children. We both finished our college degrees while working and raising our kids. Lucy is now an elementary school teacher, and I've started my own small construction company. My parents? They live in a small apartment across town. My mother works full-time now as a store clerk. My father does odd jobs when his health allows it. The restraining order expired 2 years ago, but they've never attempted to contact us. I heard through extended family that they occasionally ask about Oliver and Grace, but they've never tried to rebuild the relationship they destroyed. Sometimes I wonder if they regret what they did. Do they realize they traded a relationship with their grandchildren for money they never even got? Do they understand that their greed cost them everything that mattered? I may never know the answers to those questions. What I do know is that Judge Torr's words that day changed the trajectory of our entire family. Her refusal to let my parents manipulate the system saved my son and protected our family from people who claimed to love us, but were willing to destroy us for profit. There are moments when I feel sad about losing my parents. Oliver will never know his grandparents on my side, and Grace will never have that relationship either. But I've learned that family isn't just about blood relations, it's about the people who genuinely love and support you. Lucy's parents have become amazing grandparents to our children. We've built friendships with other young parents who have become like extended family. Oliver and Grace are surrounded by people who love them unconditionally. As for the money that started this whole nightmare, I sometimes think about my grandfather and his will. Did he intend for his inheritance provisions to tear families apart? Or was he trying to ensure his great-grandchildren were raised by people who truly cared about them? I like to think it was the latter, and in a twisted way, his will worked exactly as intended. Oliver ended up being raised by the people who loved him most, not the people who saw him as a financial opportunity. The judge's words that day will stay with me forever. This court exists to protect children and families. Judge Torres didn't just rule in our favor, she protected the fundamental principle that children deserve to be with parents who love them, not with adults who see them as means to an end. That's a lesson I'll teach Oliver and Grace as they grow up, that true love is never conditional on money, status, or personal gain. True love means putting someone else's well-being ahead of your own desires, even when it's difficult or costly. My parents failed that test, But every day, Lucy and I get to pass it by choosing our children's happiness over everything else. And that's worth more than any inheritance could ever be.